Brunete, Spain, 1937. The droning hum of your brand new Messerschmitt fighter echoes in your ears, while up ahead you see the sun glinting off the wings of the red fighters up ahead. The years of peace since Germany's defeat have been boring and dull for a pilot, but now, here in the skies of Spain, you finally get a chance to test your skills, to feel the thrill of aerial combat. Approaching them from behind, you merge seamlessly and attack their formation, your machine guns blazing. The sky is filled with whirling planes and gunfire as adrenaline courses through your veins. You lock onto a target. The red pilot is good, frantically trying to maneuver away. You chase him in a relentless descending spiral, lining up your guns. Opening fire. Your bullets strike true, and the burning plane falls into a death spiral. Your first kill, the first of many. Soon, you think, it won't just be over Spain, but Paris, London, Moscow and New York. Nothing can stop the Condor Legion. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hi there everyone, welcome to the show. In the last episode, the Republic's northern enclave was in danger of collapse, while behind the lines the communists clashed with the anarchists and the plume in Barcelona. The communists now had control of the war effort, at least behind the scenes, and they were determined to show they could win the war. 2 great offensives would be launched, the outcome of which would decide the fate of Spain. Having become the dominant force in the Republican zone, the communists had little time to celebrate their victory. The Civil War was going badly for the Republic in July 1937. Bilbao and most of the Basque Country had fallen already, while the rest of the northern enclave was slowly being crushed. Once the war ended here, the nationalists would have numerical parity with the Republic. In Madrid, spirits sank as supplies dwindled. There was little to consume except a liquor laced with vanilla extract, which tasted like varnish remover, and Dr. Negrin's victory pills, also known as lentils. Barcelona, once the powerhouse of the Republic, was now sullen and defeatist after the May days. The communists and their allies, like the new Republican leader, Juan Negrin, desperately needed a great victory. A successful offensive would raise morale, cement their dominance and divert nationalist troops from the north. Inevitably, the Madrid front was chosen. The capital had become an obsession for the communists, just like it had been for Franco. The legend of its heroic defence the source of their legitimacy. After the Battle of Madrid and the Republican victories at Jarama and Guadalajara, the nationalist positions around Madrid looked like a capital E. To the north and south they stretched around the capital, while in the middle a large salient stretched all the way to the western fringes of Madrid. The communist plan was to cut off and surround this salient by attacking its weakly defended flanks in a gigantic pincer movement. The main force would attack from the north through the village of Brunete, from which this battle would get its name, while another strike would come from the south. Meeting in the middle, they would cut the Extremadura highway and isolate the Madrid garrison. They could then finish off the elite Moroccan and Spanish Foreign Legion troops trapped inside at their leisure, a devastating potential loss for Franco. It was a good plan, similar to some of the great double encirclements of the upcoming Second World War. It even involved blitzkrieg-style tactics, with tanks meant to spearhead the advance and operate deep behind enemy lines. His creator, Colonel Rojo, boasted of its, quote, rigorous technical beauty, almost perfect, end quote. When someone calls a plan practically perfect, always start worrying. To implement this great encirclement, they assembled one of the most impressive Republican armies ever to take the field. 100,000 soldiers backed by 132 tanks, 43 other armoured vehicles, 217 field guns, 50 bombers and 90 fighters. It was the biggest concentration of forces yet seen in the Civil War. All 5 international brigades and the communists' best-known formations were given key roles, while every important officer had a Soviet advisor at his elbow. They even had the element of surprise. This was pretty amazing, as the cafes of Madrid had been buzzing for weeks with talk of the coming offensive. Julian Bell, Virginia Woolf's nephew, who was driving an ambulance for the Republican Army, wrote home in a letter they had, quote, the worst forebodings for the military results of anything so public as our present operation, end quote. Yet Franco's generals dismissed all the reports coming in, believing they were a false flag operation. For the first and last time in the war, the Republicans entered the Battle of Brunete, holding virtually all the cards. Victory seemed assured. President Azana wrote with just a hint of foreboding that, quote, if we cannot succeed with such forces, we will not be able to manage it anywhere, end quote. What could possibly go wrong? As it would turn out, plenty. Brunete would become a disaster for the Republic due to 3 key flaws. The first wasn't actually the Republic's fault. Instead, it had much more to do with politics back in Moscow. Brunete had been designed as a blitzkrieg-style operation, with tanks used as armoured fists. However, by July 1937, there was no way such tactics could be used anymore. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's Great Purge was scathing through the Red Army's leadership, and caught in the net was Marshal Tukhachevsky. He had been the great Russian proponent of armoured warfare, but now he had been tortured into confessing to treason and espionage for the Germans. With both Tukhachevsky and his circle executed, no Soviet advisor dared to follow his tactical theories. Far from armoured fists, the tanks were split up, all along the line, and instead of leaving strong points to be dealt with by the foot-slogging infantry, the breakthrough force would halt until they were overrun, losing crucial momentum. The second great flaw was the communist commanders themselves. Men such as Valentin Gonçalves, known as El Campesino, the peasant, and Enrique Lister had been dynamic and aggressive officers at battalion level, but they were completely out of their depth here. Suddenly, they had to control up to 30 battalions at once while fighting a war of manoeuvre involving complicated movements of men and supplies. Though they would never admit it, they weren't ready for prime time. According to one of their colleagues, they not only didn't know how to read a military map, they didn't see why they should learn at all. They didn't know how to handle the monstrous traffic jams formed by tanks, guns, infantry columns and trucks bringing up replacements and supplies, and even the ambulances bringing back the wounded. They also paid the price for having failed to impress on the drivers of all those vehicles that they had to supplement their revolutionary enthusiasm with humdrum details like oiling and greasing their engines and slowing down on curbs. They struggled to coordinate infantry, artillery, armour and aircraft, with tanks sometimes going into action with no foot soldiers to follow them up. Planes bombed positions which had been abandoned by the enemy, and sometimes even bombed their own men. They'd also learned some terrible lessons from their Soviet advisors. Commanders under massive pressure to produce results would claim to have reached a particular point when they were nowhere near it. This was a huge problem for the Red Army in World War II as well. Some Republican commanders, out of vanity, lied to their superiors deliberately. For example, El Campesino would shamelessly exaggerate nationalist casualties in Quijona when it finally fell to justify his initial lack of success. Lister, in his after-battle report, quadrupled the number of enemy defending Brunete, and even claimed at one point that his troops had reached Navalcarnero. when in fact they had been 12 kilometres short of it. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly, the pilots of the Condor Legion and those Spaniards they had trained were simply better than Republican pilots. They would achieve air superiority early on and would rain death down the Republican army throughout the battle. Like so many offences in the Civil War, it seemed to start well. In the early hours of the 6th of July, the stunned nationalist defenders found themselves being pounded by artillery fire as Republican planes rained down bombs from above, and wave after wave of troops assaulted their positions. The nationalist front line in the north, lightly held and with big gaps between units, disintegrated in the first couple of hours. The Republican troops found themselves marching along, singing rousing revolutionary songs under a bright, cloudless sky, marred only by a great black cloud rising over an ammunition dump in the village of Keona, which had taken a direct hit. A worse threat than Franco's bullets was the oppressive heat, which rose to over 100 degrees, and most canteens were empty by 10 in the morning. The Guadarrama River, 2 feet high when the action started, dried up in a few hours to a chain of rancid puddles. Still, the smell of victory was intoxicating. Lister's 11th Division drove all the way to Brunete, and before the sun went down, it had captured the town with barely a shot being fired, a whole week ahead of schedule. They only had to go on 10 more miles due south to reach the nationalist headquarters of Navacanero and cut the main road, which was the lifeline of Franco's forces in the capital. But those 10 miles may as well have been 10 million. Lister halted his advance, dug in, and waited for the troops on his flanks to catch up. It was a fatal mistake. El Campesino had been supposed to secure Lister's right flank, but his incompetence saw him headbutting the main strong point of Keona with frontal attacks against its Falangist defenders, instead of bypassing the village. It took him 3 days of intense fighting and heavy casualties to capture Keona, partly because they had not surrounded it properly. This gave the nationalists time to reinforce the Falangists with Moroccan troops. Meanwhile, Lister's men sat behind the defences and waited for him to finish. By the time it was overrun, the village was a useless burning wreck, and vital time had been lost. On the left flank, General Enrique Jurado had botched his assault on the village of Villanueva de la Canada, a key communications site. Not until the British battalion turned up did the village fall the next day. Having been decimated at Jarama, the British brigade had been painstakingly rebuilt. It was now under the command of George Nathan, an eccentric homosexual former British Army officer. One veteran described him as, quote, immaculately dressed, his boots being polished to the point of dazzlement by one or other of his invariably good-looking batmen. He genuinely found himself a mercenary leader, resourceful, brave, and respected by all. The very sight of Nathan with his gold-tipped swagger stick was an encouragement to his men. End quote. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade had also been rebuilt after its heavy casualties at Jarama. Now it was under the command of Oliver Law, the first African-American to lead a company of white men. He'd had a hard life. Growing up in the segregationist South, he served in the U.S. Army before leaving just in time for the Great Depression. Becoming a socialist, he had suffered many a beating at the hands of the police, but he had remade himself in the Spanish Civil War, becoming one of the International Brigade's most effective officers. In the meantime, 2 Republican reconnaissance soldiers, captured by the Nationalists, admitted that Navacanero was indeed the objective of the offensive. The town had no defences, and no garrison, save a handful of civil guards and supply detachments. Lister's delay saved Franco's men. Within 24 hours of the offensive starting, Nationalist reinforcements were flooding in. While Lister waited and El Campesino was bogged down at Keona, the only progress was on the left. The 15th International Division, which included the Abraham Lincoln and British brigades, advanced on the village of Bodilla del Monte. If it was captured, the Republicans would be tantalizingly close to the slums of the Carabanchel, where the second pincer was meant to be coming from. But to get to the Promised Land, they first had to capture a small hill. Here is where some of the bloodiest fighting of the whole battle would occur. Soon it would earn the infamous nickname Mosquito Hill, after the incessant buzzing of bullets overhead. For those listeners who remember Suicide Hill at the Battle of Jarama, Mosquito Hill will soon rival it for sheer bloodshed. The Lincolns and the Brits were ordered to lead the assault. Victory is guaranteed. We only have to take this hill, comrades, and the fascists will flee. Long live the Republic! Long live Comrade Stalin! Observing the hill, with its heights bristling machine guns and nationalist fanatics, you know this will not be easy, no matter what these strutting peacocks of commissars say. You look at Law, and you can see that he knows this is a suicide mission as well. Still, he orders you into formation, his face now set in grim determination. Raising his hand, he shouts, "Forward! Let's go!" You march across the open ground, the baking heat weighing down upon you as clouds of dust sting your eyes. The machine guns open up. Men drop, screaming into the now blood-drenched earth. You press on with the remaining survivors, Law in front, shouting encouragement. Standing tall and unflinching, he refuses to crawl. Still the machine guns blast away, doing their lethal work. Everywhere your comrades are falling. Then, suddenly, Law's body snaps back as bullets find their mark. He falls over, arms outstretched, and you race over to him. Barely conscious, he is still muttering, "No passaran," like a mantra, as he slowly passes away. The attack failed. The Lincolns had to leave Law where he fell, on Mosquito Hill, with dozens of others who never saw another sunrise. The fighting here was truly horrific. Men thrown across open ground without cover, straight into walls of lead. Italian and German planes were soon bombing the hillside, as men hugged the barren, parched earth. One survivor recounted, quote, "That awful whistle, scream and rush of the bombs, then the explosion. The whole earth was blasted into pieces. It heaved and rocked and swayed and roared and smoked, and the bombs kept coming down." End quote. 6 days into the offensive, and it had turned from a war of movement, World War II style, into mini Verdun or Somme from World War I. Men surged back and forth over the devastated countryside of blackened wheat fields, splintered cork oak trees, burning out tanks and screaming men, for a continuous burst of bombs and shells and rattle of machine guns, trying to chase each other out of holes in the ground a few yards apart. Perhaps the worst part of this battle was the insane heat that turned dead men into mummies and drove the living mad with thirst. The inside of tanks became ovens, while soldiers debated whether it was better to drink a last cupful of water or to save it to cool down the Maxim gun that might otherwise turn red and blow up in their faces. Harry Fisher, a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, remembers frantically digging in the hard-baked bed of the Rio Guadarrama down to a level where he could find little pockets of mud, out of which a few drops of water might be squeezed. It was the same for the Nationalists. One soldier remembered waiting in an improvised trench on Mosquito Ridge, holding Molotov cocktails. The man beside him, out of his mind with thirst, smashed the neck of his bottle on the barrel of his gun and gulped down the petrol inside. That's how thirsty they were. Even petrol looked good. As fighting raged in the north, The International Brigaders were shocked to find out the pincer from the south wasn't coming. It had failed to break through the Nationalist lines and was cancelled after only 2 days. All the lives lost at Mosquito Hill were for nothing, trying to link up with an army that wasn't coming. In one way, Brunete had been a success. It forced Franco to rush reinforcements to Madrid. 31 battalions, 7 batteries of artillery, and the entire Condor Legion, around 70 planes, arrived. It delayed the next offensive in the north by 5 weeks. But now at Brunete, the Republic had lost all its advantages. Huge aerial dogfights raged in the skies above, as we saw at the start of the podcast, with up to 200 fighters at a time battling for supremacy. The Nationalists won this epic struggle mainly thanks to the skill of their pilots, including future German World War II ace Adolf Galland. Then, Junker 52s, Fiats, and Heinkel 51s hammered the 8 Republican divisions concentrated on less than 200 square kilometres of the bare Castilian plain. The first targets of the Nationalist planes were the T-26 tanks, which presented easy prey in the open. Within 2 days, once the Nationalists had established their maximum rhythm of sorties, the Republicans were left with only 38 armoured vehicles still in action. By July the 16th, the Republicans were completely exhausted. Most of their brigades had lost 40 to 60% of their men in just over a week, while for the 15th International it was 80%. It was now the Nationalists' turn to go on the offensive. Casualties were sky high as they battled over ground that had already been levelled and was covered in shell holes. It was only the Condor Legion that allowed them to make some gains. They had a new weapon. Every fighter now carried a load of 6 10-kilo fragmentation bombs. Flying wingtip to wingtip, they released their loads simultaneously. Trenches, unless dug in a zigzag pattern, provided little protection. One German squadron leader boasted that in a 200-metre stretch of trench, 120 bodies had been found after one of their attacks. The Legion's commander, von Richthofen, exulted that, quote, countless red casualties, which are already decomposing in the heat. Everywhere shot up red tanks. A great sight. The situation here has been saved by the air crews. The ground forces are not up to it. End quote. Pushed to breaking point, Lister's men broke and ran. The Communists shot 400 of them to restore discipline, but it was too late. What was left of Brunete was recaptured by the Nationalists. The lines finally stabilised, with the Nationalists having recaptured half the ground they lost. The Republicans still held a few gains, like Keona, but this whole area had been flattened into a moonscape. These gains weren't really worth controlling. Most importantly, Franco's forces in Madrid hadn't been cut off. Both sides claimed victory, and it's often described as an indecisive battle, but really it was a massive Republican defeat. To achieve an advance of only 50 square kilometres, they suffered 25,000 casualties, the loss of 80% of their armoured force, and a third of their fighters. These losses would never be replaced. To make matters worse, they lost some of their best troops. The Lincoln Brigade had started the battle 900 strong. Barely 250 were fit for action by the end. It was so decimated they had to merge with the Washington Brigade. The British Brigade had once again been destroyed. Out of the 350 men who entered the battle, just 42 remained standing at the end. Even George Nath had been killed near the end of the battle. The international brigades as a whole were in an awful state after Brunete. They had suffered 4,300 casualties out of a total strength of 13,353, and nearly 5,000 men were in hospital. International volunteers now formed only around 10% of the strength of the 11th Brigade. The rest were Spaniards who naturally resented being commanded by foreign officers who could not speak their language. The 14th and 15th Brigades were both reduced from 4 to less than 2 battalions. The Nationalists had taken a beating too, suffering 17,000 casualties, but a much lower proportion were killed, and their losses in equipment and aircraft were far lighter and easily replaceable. With the fall of Bilbao and the May Days, the Republic hadn't been doing well before July the 6th, but Brunete was a true turning point of the war. Never again would the Republic have the same advantages they had here. The war would rage on, and the Communists would launch more great offensives, but they would all repeat the same mistakes and end the same way. Meanwhile, as Stalin's Great Purge back in the Soviet Union went into high gear, the same madness seemed to infect his Spanish acolytes. Communist propaganda had been getting increasingly ridiculous since Jarama, but now it reached new levels of lunacy. During Brunete, one much mocked communiqué claimed that, quote, "the advance continued without the loss of any territory," end quote. Another that, quote, "the dead were recovered with their arms stiff in the revolutionary salute," end quote. It was even claimed Oliver Law gave an elaborate speech praising Stalin while dying on the battlefield. Because that's what you do when you're bleeding out on a foreign field. Praise the great leader. Brunete itself was turned from a disaster into a glorious communist victory. In a new low, a commissar proudly boasted to the bloodied and battered brigaders that the offensive, quote, had totally vindicated the active war policy of the Negrin government, following the laissez-faire attitude of that Trotskyite Largo Caballero, end quote. Communist favoritism and preaching at the front reached such levels of craziness that former supporters among the regular officers were horrified. Wounded men were refused medical aid unless they joined the party, with commissars hovering over the hospital beds of men on death's doorstep, demanding they convert, like a modern version of the Spanish Inquisition. Battalion commanders who rejected invitations to join the party found weapon replacements, ammunition, food, or even their men's pay cut off. Worst of all, Moscow's paranoia about Trotskyite saboteurs spread like a virus behind the Republican lines. Soon, Stalin's great rival was being credited with almost superhuman powers. His supposed agents were allegedly everywhere and capable of anything. Every blunder, of which there were many, was blamed on their sabotage. Andrei Marty, the obese, watery-eyed, beret-wearing leader of the brigaders, became so paranoid that he blamed his piles on supposed Trotskyite poisoners. Exactly why the Trotskyites wanted to give him piles was never answered. Republican generals placed machine gun positions behind their own troops, ordering them to kill anyone who retreated for any reason. Hundreds of Republican soldiers were shot, both during Brunete and afterwards, for alleged sabotage and Trotskyite sympathies. General Waters shot a quarter of his officers, writing to headquarters that, quote, "the surrender of Brunete and the flight of many brigades were to a significant extent the result of panic sown by the fifth column that the fascists have spread around our forces," end quote. Soon, this witch hunt would turn its full force on the international brigades. Mutinies in the British and Lincoln brigades against the senseless slaughter were put down with threats to shoot all the survivors. Any sign of criticism or complaint led to accusations of being a Trotskyist saboteur. For those who continued to make waves, a bullet or a visit to a concentration camp awaited. With our great triumph at Brunete, final victory is just around the corner, comrades, bellows out the commissar. He is a large, fat specimen with a drooping moustache, kitted out in a well-fitted uniform and modern pistol, despite the fact he has never been to the front lines. His latest speech to the international brigades is going down like a lead balloon. Most of the faces of your comrades are either bored or unimpressed, but Maurice's shows increasing anger. Finally, he snaps. Before you can stop him, he yells out, "That's it. I want to go home. Give me my passport back." The commissar stares at him nonplussed, seemingly amazed that someone interrupted his bleatings. Maurice shouts again, "I want my passport. No one said anything about staying here forever. I fought at Madrid, Jarama, and Brunete. I've done my part. Coming back to reality, the Commissar sneers back. You would abandon the struggle, comrade? What a coward! Sounds like something a Trotskyist would do. Unwisely, Maurice's face turns red, and he yells, You call me coward? You, who hide in the rear? Before he can finish, the Commissar raises his pistol and shoots Maurice in the head. As his body falls to the floor and you get over your shock, the Commissar would have been lynched if his guards hadn't raised their weapons. For the first time you notice how his small, pig-like eyes look sickly and red-flecked, radiating suspicion and a hint of madness. The Commissar begins ranting. He was a Trotskyist, betraying us to Franco, Hitler, Mussolini and the Japanese. People like him are responsible for every setback. We would have won this war already, if not for this scum. Perhaps you're all Trotskyites too. Rats, undermining us from within. Rats, I tell you. Before this strange sight, the men begin slipping away, leaving the Commissar mumbling randomly to himself, looking around in suspicion as if Trotsky could appear at any minute. This wasn't why you came to Spain. This is madness. Many brigaders thought they could go home after 6 months' service, but they soon learnt they couldn't leave. The passports they had surrendered when they had first arrived had been sent to Moscow for use by Stalin's spies. They were trapped, their mail censored, constantly watched by the commissars. For some, the old faith remained. Others were still committed to fighting fascism. But for many, disillusionment and cynicism quickly took hold. As the communist witch hunt for imaginary saboteurs raged on, Franco slowly tightened his stranglehold on the Republic. In the summer of 1937, Franco received faulty intelligence that a vast Soviet fleet was going to transport weapons to Republican Spain. Desperate to stop this phantom fleet, he persuaded Mussolini to reinforce the nationalist naval blockade by strapping on an eye patch and taking to the Mediterranean Sea as a pirate. Well, he didn't really put an eye patch on, but he did unleash his submarines and bombers. Trade into Republican Spain was largely dominated by the British merchant marines, some ships being little more than rust buckets used by unscrupulous owners because they attracted the lowest insurance premiums. They were also British only in the very loosest sense of the word. While they flew its flag, most of the ships had foreign crews and were actually owned by Greek shipping tycoons, who happily traded with both sides. It would be these vessels, along with Soviet shipping, that would bear the brunt of the so-called Pirate Summer of 1937. Using Mallorca as a base, in August alone they sank 200,000 tons of shipping bound for Republican Spain, including 8 British and 18 other neutral merchantmen. To provide the thinnest of cover stories, Italy claimed the attacks were by Mediterranean pirates. Nothing to do with the Duchy at all. Don't be so suspicious, you. London and Paris knew perfectly well that it was the Italians sinking their ships. The British Admiralty had broken the Italians' naval code, mainly thanks to their amiable habits of enciphering leading articles from El Popolo d'Italia and Mussolini's public speeches. But this was the time of appeasement. They were desperate to avoid a fight, so began a diplomatic dance that made the democracies look spineless and pathetic. At first they just tried to ignore that it was happening at all. Then, as losses mounted, they blamed unknown submarines. Nobody was fooled. Mussolini was hailed as the unknown statesman, and Parisians took to calling the Boulevard of the Italians the Boulevard of the Strangers. Allied warships in the Mediterranean were under strict instructions to do nothing to antagonize Italy. This led to ludicrous scenes. One merchantman was actually sunk within sight of a British destroyer, while Italian aircraft on missions to attack shipping would fly from Mallorca with impunity over Royal Navy and French Navy warships in Palma Harbour. It didn't help that Britain's representatives to Italy were at least sympathetic to fascism. Our man in Rome, Lord Perth, another aristocratic nincompoop, was described by Italian Foreign Minister Ciano as, quote, a genuine convert, a man who has come to understand and even to love fascism, end quote. Meanwhile, Britain's new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was also using as a personal envoy his sister-in-law, Lady Chamberlain, who proudly wore fascist badges and insignia. Britain's already faint protests about the sinkings became little more than polite suggestions from this duo. Reading the tea leaves correctly, Mussolini got bolder and stepped up his attacks. Finally, it was France that acted decisively and organised an international conference. It met at Nyon in Switzerland in September 1937. It resolved that British and French fleets would retaliate against submarines. It appeared to be a bold stand, maybe even the end of appeasement. British code breakers discovered that Italian submarines were ordered to withdraw from the Mediterranean before the conference even met, and although Mussolini boasted to Hitler that the submarine sinkings would continue, they ceased. Yet this solitary moment of defiance was soon watered down. It already carefully didn't mention attacks by aircraft or surface ships, and even that famous resolution to attack submarines was soon watered down completely. Worse was to come. Most of the great powers were given an area to patrol in the Mediterranean to protect against these submarines. The Soviet Union was excluded, but Italy was given its own area to patrol. It was rather like giving Blackbeard anti-piracy duties in the Caribbean during the golden age of piracy. Not for nothing did Ciano gloat in his diary, quote, from suspected pirates to policemen of the Mediterranean, and the Russians, whose ships we are sinking, excluded. End quote. Shipping to Republican Spain would continue to be harassed until the end of the war, if not quite as boldly as during the pirate summer. It also forced the Soviets to permanently abandon the Mediterranean as a supply route. Soviet aid to the Republic dropped considerably as a result. With Republican Spain now increasingly starved of supplies, and Franco about to resume his offensive in the north, the government in Valencia was at a crossroads. It could hunker down and go on the defensive, hoping for a wider European war to break out. With hindsight, this was probably the correct strategy to have followed. Instead, at the insistence of the Communists, another great offensive was planned for August. The Aragon front was chosen for the next Republican attack, mainly for political reasons. The Grin government and its communist allies were determined to finally crush anarchist power in Catalonia. Troops under Valencia's control flooded in, destroying the collectives set up by the anarchists back in 1936 and conducting mass arrests of their opponents. Like so many communist measures, it greatly increased their power at the expense of further undermining the Republic's war effort. A resentful Catalonia, with its countryside in chaos, would be a poor base for the upcoming attack. The Battle of Belchite would be a strange offensive, with decisions being made based more on propaganda value than military considerations. Even the name, Battle of Belchite, is something of a communist-inspired lie to cover up failure. More on that later. The actual target of the offensive was meant to be Saragossa. The recapture of this regional capital offered more than just symbolic significance. It was also the communications centre of the whole Aragon front. The first year of the war in this part of Spain had emphasised that the possession of a key town was of far greater importance than control of wide-open areas of countryside. Some lessons have been learned from Brunete. There will be 3 major attacks along a 100-kilometre front, one in the north, near Zuera, one in the centre, near Villamayor, and one in the south, near Belchite. The 3 prongs were meant to surround and capture Saragossa. By splitting up their attacking forces, the Republicans hoped to achieve 2 things. Firstly, any nationalist counterattack would be divided, unable to focus on one area like at Brunete. Secondly, they would offer less concentrated targets for the Condor Legion's bombing and strafing runs. At Brunete, the restricted front had offered them a target-rich environment, right out of a von Richthofen wet dream. Another formidable force was amassed. 80,000 infantry, supported by 105 Soviet-supplied tanks, primarily BT-5s, and up to 200 aircraft. They would have, at least at the start, complete local superiority on the ground and the air. Victory was seen as a foregone conclusion, with General Modesto telling his men that, quote, "the operation was bound to be successful," end quote. When anyone says that about a military operation, be afraid. Be very afraid. In fact, rather than coming up with contingency plans in case it wasn't a walkover, Modesto spent most of his time complaining that General Lister's division would have the glory of being the first formation to enter the city. Yeah, just like Brunete, beneath the shiny exterior, there were deep weaknesses. Blitzkrieg was still in disrepute, so once again Republican commanders are going to try and capture every strong point as they advance, rather than going round them. Meanwhile, those 80,000 troops were a mishmash of communists, anarchists, and brigaders. The anarchist units in Catalonia had now been merged into the main army, and they had deep suspicion of their new communist commanders, often refusing to obey their orders. They also retained their old habit of attacking the strongest part of fortifications out of a sense of honour, leading to truly horrific casualties. Even the brigades weren't the force they used to be. As the flow of volunteers became a trickle, their commissars began kidnapping foreign workers and sailors on shore leave to refill their ranks. As you would expect, these men were not committed to the cause in the slightest. At Belchite, for the first time, brigaders are going to defect to the nationalists as a result. The offensive began on the 24th of August. To maintain the advantage of surprise, there had been no artillery bombardment nor attacks by the Republican Air Force. Right from the start, early progress was sabotaged by hesitancy. In the north, the 27th Division occupied Zuera towards midday, then halted as they waited for explicit orders on what to do next. In the centre, General Kleber smashed through the weak nationalist lines with his 45th Division, reaching the town of Villamayor only about 6 kilometres from the key target of Saragossa. But there he halted, worried about his lack of intelligence on enemy defences, and waiting for more orders. In the south, they were having more success, but at a terrible cost. Nationalist resistance was fanatical in the towns of Kodo and Quinto, and it took fierce house-to-house fighting to overrun them. When they eventually fell, the Republicans controlled piles of rubble. To balance these so-called successes, General Lister suffered a severe defeat. He had the majority of the operation's tanks, driven by Russian crews with Spanish helpers. 48 BT-5 tanks, carrying Spanish troops, were meant to attack and capture the heavily fortified town of Fuentes de Ebro, opening up the road to Saragossa. This was meant to be the key strike of the campaign, but instead it was completely botched. The tanks were found to be unsuitable to carry troops. Little reconnaissance was carried out, and to maintain secrecy, there had been no prior artillery bombardments. Those tanks soon became bogged down in the mud and were picked off by the nationalist anti-tank guns, one by one. "We need to get moving. We're sitting ducks here," you yell at Orlov, the Russian driving the tank you're in. He snarls back. "It's not that easy, Spaniard. The mud here is worse than Ukraine." The tank treads try to get purchase, but you're barely moving through the muddy mire. Meanwhile, the fascist anti-tank guns are doing their lethal work. You watch another tank that's stuck in the mud erupt into flames as a shell strikes it. "Put it in reverse then, Orlov. For heaven's sakes!" He looks up in fear. "If we retreat, we're dead men. The officers will shoot us." Gritting your teeth, you reply, "If we stay here, we're dead men." A tank to your right explodes. A screaming crewman emerges from the turret on fire. That's it. You're not waiting to get picked off. As Orloff continues to gun the engine, you leap out of the tank into the mud with a squelch. As you try and wade through the mire, a huge explosion knocks you flat. Looking behind, you see the burning remains of your former tank. None of your comrades emerge from it. Virtually all the BT-5s were destroyed. Meanwhile, the infantry that was meant to support them never arrived. A Lincoln brigader acidly commented, quote, "Courage and heroism are plentiful in Spain, and the Spanish people have no lack of it. What they need is tactics. And as for tactics, Regiment BT was bankrupt." End quote. A furious Modesto blamed Lister for the disaster, and from then on the mutual hatred of the two great communist leaders became a major problem. The local commissars, of course, blamed the disaster on Trotskyite saboteurs, quote, "the interference of fascist elements who roused mutual hostility between the two, and thus weakened the strength of the Fifth Corps." End quote. Interestingly, it's likely there had been sabotage, but it had nothing to do with Trotsky or fascists. A secret report to Moscow blamed, quote, "the open sabotage of Lister, who did not want to be subordinate to Modesto." End quote. It sometimes feels that the Republic was defeating itself. The offensive was already running out of steam a few days after it was launched, and now nationalist reinforcements were flooding in. Yet, unlike at Brunete, Franco refused to send troops from the northern front. His offensive there ground on relentlessly forward, making the Saragossa offensive a complete failure. The communists, however, needed to turn this into a victory somehow to justify the cost. Modesto had a solution. They would change the objective of the offensive. Instead of Saragossa, they would capture the town of Belchite. It was all very much like Orwell's novel 1984. In just a day, all the propaganda changed. Saragossa? Never heard of it. The target of this offensive is Belchite. It has always been Belchite. The town in question was of little strategic value. Less than 4,000 people lived there before the battle began. Yet it now became a living hell for Republican and Nationalists alike. The Nationalists had prepared their defences well, taking full advantage of the narrow, twisting streets. Machine gun positions, some of them made in ferro-concrete, and others in specially prepared houses, were everywhere. Key buildings at the seminary and the church of San Augustine were also heavily fortified. 7,000 fanatical nationalists awaited the assault. The attack on Belchite began at 10 in the morning on the 1st of September. Artillery pounded the city, while aircraft bombed it from above, flown by the first Spanish pilots to graduate from training schools in the Soviet Union. Much of the town was reduced to rubble, but this actually favoured the defenders. It became a nightmare for tanks, forcing the Republicans to rely on infantry. It was house-to-house fighting, with soldiers forcing entry through walls with pickaxes, followed by grenade throws to dislodge defenders barricaded in the ruined buildings. Republican soldiers suffered in the stifling heat, built parapets of rotting bodies stacked 8 feet high, and floating gas masks because they could not bear the stench. By the 6th of September the city had finally fallen, but it was little more than a blackened ruin which had cost thousands of lives. So great was the danger of epidemics that the Republicans finally turned the site into a vast crematorium. They soaked the corpses in petrol and burned them. As the survivors departed in the smoky light of the funeral pyre, they left behind a town so devastated that when Ernest Hemingway visited it the following month, he could not tell where the streets had been. Belchite would become one of the most famous battles of the war, mainly because when Franco won, he ordered that its remains be preserved as a symbol of communist destruction. A whole new town was built beside the ruins by the slave labour of Republican prisoners. Today it's a major dark tourism site. I'll post some photos from there on our Blue Sky channel and Facebook page. Completely exhausted, the Republicans had endured the inevitable nationalist counterattacks. By the time the front stabilised in October, they had gained just 10 kilometres of ground and a few ruined towns. In exchange, they lost thousands of soldiers and most of their tanks and artillery. The Republican defense minister, Indalecio Prieto, bitterly complained that, quote, so many troops to take 4 or 5 pueblos does not satisfy the Ministry of Defense, end quote. So did the communists admit fault and decide to rethink their strategy of overambitious offensives that were grinding down the Republic? No, they blamed Trotskyite saboteurs and launched yet another round of purges. Meanwhile, they declared it was a great victory to the outside world as they had taken Belchite. Yay! As they faced criticism, even from former allies, a secret report commissioned by the Communist Party of Spain's leadership made the sinister suggestion that, quote, the popular revolution cannot end successfully if the Communist Party does not take power into its own hands, end quote. Things were about to get much worse for the Republic. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, the war in the North comes to its epic conclusion, while the communists decide that it's 3 times the charm and launch yet another overambitious offensive. And this one will finally break the back of the Republican Army. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.